Production funding for this program is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
From serving our country as a U.S. Marine to serving the impoverished around the world, we're here with a change maker, a global change maker. It's time for a conversation with Jake Harriman. So let's start out with your backstory. You as a child, because you had a father that served, and that kind of laid the foundation for all the amazing things that you're doing now, and even the catalyst that was the pivot point. So give us a little bit about your childhood.
Well, I grew up in a little place in West Virginia, farm, and we were poor by American standards, but I didn't know it. My parents were incredible. My father and my mother gave us a great childhood where they taught us the importance of service, first at the community level, to always be serving those around us who were a little more poor than we were, whether it was bringing them meals or helping with chop firewood for them, whatever it was, we were always trying to look for opportunities to serve others. And that really had a lasting impression on me. You know, growing up on the farm, we grew all the food we ate, we hunted all, for our meat, really living off the land, and it allowed me a great opportunity to see, how the importance of hard work and perseverance and how to serve the community around you. My father was in the Navy, served 4 years in the Navy, and I remember from a very young age, he didn't talk about it much, but every year on the 4th of July, we'd sit around as a family around our small little black and white TV, and we watched the 4th of July parades. And I remember seeing him tear up every single year as he'd watch the parades. And at first, as a little kid, I was kind of scared to see your dad crying. And I thought, is he sick? Is there something in his eye? Like, what's wrong here? But as I got older, I began to realize the deep devotion and commitment that he had to our country. His understanding of what freedom really cost, his understanding and observation of all the sacrifice that he and his friends had sacrifices they'd made during the Vietnam War. And that really began to have a lasting impression on me, and I began to feel the tug of service in my own life.
And so you signed up and you applied to go to the Navy.
That's right.
And ultimately you decided to take a year and kind of go a different direction, but you ended up back at the Navy.
That's
so
right.
Share a little about kind of that phase of being a young 17-year-old and then ultimately saying, you know what, this is the path for me.
Well, I wanted to try. I felt the tug, like I said, from my father. And so I applied to the Naval Academy, got in, and then the recruiters came and they told me, look, you need to wear a tie every day, and you're going to have to be in the military for 6 years. And all of a sudden, all these overwhelming commitments were a little too much for me as a 17-year-old. So I saw my friends going to the local university, West Virginia University, and I decided that's the route for me. I'm going to go with my buddies. I was a naive 17-year-old. I didn't really understand the full implications of my decisions at the time. So sure enough, 6 months into my first year at WVU, I began to see, I wanted to see the world. I grew up in poverty. I'd never been outside of West Virginia. I wanted to see and experience the world, have adventure, excitement. So I reapplied. I reapplied to the Naval Academy, and just through, I think, sheer stubbornness and perseverance, they let me back in. And so I was able to attend the Naval Academy to get my degree and follow on service.
But see, that's hope for everyone that says, I apply, I can go back over here and I can get back in. So perseverance. But share with us a little about just kind of the phase of going in and the training to be a Marine officer and kind of setting the stage to ultimately then being deployed.
So coming out of the Naval Academy, I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. And first I went to the basic school in Quantico. All the officers training starts there. And then following, I got selected for infantry. So you go through the infantry officers course, which is a 10-week course in Quantico. And then I got assigned to my first unit, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, based out of Camp Pendleton, California. And while I was in my time in the Marine Corps, I had the privilege of serving with the men of 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines in infantry, and then also 1st Force Reconnaissance Company on the special operations side. And a lot of my friends and family have often asked me why I chose to fight in the wars, why I chose this path. War is a terrible thing. It's one of the worst things that we can do to one another as human beings. But there is evil in this world. Evil that causes the, injustice and inequality and oppression of freedom around the world. Evil that makes our armed forces a necessity. And frankly, it was the horrors of combat that made me into the leader and the man that I am today. And so when people ask me that question, honestly, it's not that difficult. There's two main reasons why I chose to fight. First and foremost, it was for that brother on my right and the brother on my left. You know, I knew their families. I loved them. And I had been charged with the responsibility of getting those men home to their families, whom I knew were waiting. But second, and perhaps more fundamentally, I chose to fight for the idea that is America. You know, we're over there. We don't fight for a man in the White House. We don't fight for a political party. We fight for this idea of a country that stands for the freedom of lasting, meaningful choices for everybody, everywhere.
So talk about being deployed. 2003, I believe, is the year. Very pivotal moment in your life that then sets the stage for the next chapter. But talk about a very horrific incident that changed your life.
Well, in 2003, we were one of the leading units for the Marine Corps during the Iraqi invasion. And southern Iraq at the time was one of the poorest places in the world. Saddam had been oppressing the Shia population in the south. And what is happening is we moved through southern Iraq during the invasion. The regular Iraqi army was retreating to make a final stand in Baghdad. But Saddam was pushing his special forces guys called Fedayeen south, and they were going hut to hut in these rural villages, coercing these poor farmers to fight us. You know, they were essentially saying, look, your children are starving right in front of you. If you pick up this weapon and go fight these guys 10 miles south of here, we'll drop a bag of rice off here every couple of weeks. And we were fighting these guys by the hundreds and thousands during the early days of the war. And that kind of set the stage for this first real big catalytic moment for me in combat. The first major contact in the war was a place called Nasiriyah as we moved through the south, Battle of Nasiriyah. As we began to move through the city, we got ambushed, started taking casualties, and we were able to fight through the city, set up a defensive perimeter north of Nasiriyah, where we had to dig in and wait for resupply because we hadn't eaten in a couple days. And I remember there was a thick fog on, and I knew that as the fog moved aside, they were going to start shooting at us again. So I got up out of my fighting hole, started walking the lines to check on my guys. And I remember looking north and seeing a small white car racing toward our position. Well, I thought they packed bombs in the car, they're going to blow themselves up because they just started doing suicide bombing tactics. So I grabbed 3 of my guys, took off running to the car to get it to stop. Finally, it stopped about 50 meters out. The driver hops out, starts waving his arms frantically at me and running at me. So now I think, okay, this guy strapped a bomb to himself.
Right.
He's going to blow himself up. So I'm yelling at him in Arabic to get on the ground. He's not listening. And as I raise my weapon, I think I have to take him out. I look behind him and I see a large black military truck roll up behind his little white car. 6 guys in black jump out of the truck. They run up to the car and they start shooting into the car. And so this man stops dead in his tracks, starts screaming, turns around and starts running back to the car. And that's when I realized that this man was just one of those poor farmers who was trying to escape across our lines to safety with his family because he didn't want to fight. So I yelled at my guys to take out the Fedayeen, and I ran as fast as I could to try to save this guy's family. But by the time I got there, it was too late. I looked in the passenger side. His wife had been shot in the face and in the chest, and she was slumped over dead. He had a little infant baby girl in the back whose arm had been shot off, and she'd been shot in the chest. And he was holding the body of his little 5 or 6-year-old daughter who'd been shot in the stomach, and she was choking on her own blood as she was trying to breathe. And for the first time in the war, I put myself in this guy's shoes. And I thought, it's not fair. You know, I live in a world of choices. Where do I want to go to school? Where do I want my kids to grow up? What do I want them to have for dinner? What were this man's choices when he woke up this morning? He had nothing. You know, he could watch his kids starve to death or strap a bomb to himself, blow himself up. He had nothing. And so I got really, really angry. It wasn't fair that the GPS coordinates of a person's birthplace dictated what choices they had in this world. And that was the beginning of a very powerful awakening in me. And frankly, it was the beginning of a very strong conversation between the guys and I in my unit. You know, we began to see what we believed to be a gap, a critical gap in our national security strategy. We were going out there every night on these snatch and grab missions, taking these guys out. But the movement was growing. They were growing. We'd take 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, and we began to see that, yes, we need these kinetic strikes, but at the same time, these movements are growing because they're preying on the vulnerability in these impoverished villages.
Right.
They were doing aid work. They were dropping off food. They were building schools. They were building clinics. They were winning hearts and minds. And yeah, they were horribly oppressive, but it was the only alternative some of these farmers had. So we began to think to ourselves, like, what if we could get ahead of those violent extremists? What if we could reach these vulnerable populations first? You know, what if we could begin to build lasting, meaningful choices for these folks in ways they haven't had before, long-term economic development, so they could give their families choices, food to eat, schools to go to, you know, where they can actually learn to read and make it to high school. Being able to not watch their 5-year-old son, 4-year-old daughter starve to death or die from malaria. You know, taking away that desperation to build resilience in these communities so they can stand on their own and resist violent extremism.
And that's where on your end, you're trained to fight.
Yeah.
But yet you see this gap. And so all of a sudden, that's where this pivot takes place. You go to Stanford to get your MBA, and that's where the idea and the concept, the blueprint for Nuru International is formed. Talk about forming Nuru International.
So after I got out of the Marine Corps, I decided that I was going to build a company to step into this gap in international security. The idea was to take the very best from the international development, the aid community, and learn how to build long-term sustainable economic solutions, poverty eradication models in these really vulnerable communities, but staff these programs with former operators like ourselves who know how to handle ourselves in combat in really uncertain situations. That was the idea. So I went to Stanford Business School, and about 30 of my classmates rallied around me, helped me do the research to understand, you know, what's working, what's not working in the sector, build off of those lessons learned. And then about 6 faculty members came on board and provided seed funding, mentorship, and advice. And we raised about $500,000 by the time I graduated in June of 2008. And I packed my bags in September, moved to one of the most remote areas in Kenya, in southwest Kenya, to launch the pilot project for what became known as Nuru International, a radically new approach to building sustainable solutions to build resilience in these vulnerable communities so they have alternatives to supporting the growth of violent extremism.
And what does Nuru mean?
Yeah, Nuru is a Swahili word. Actually means light or hope. We wanted it to be relevant to the people that we're working with.
And it's funny, it's not funny, well, it's funny now, it wasn't funny at the moment, but talk about your first week of doing this.
Yeah, it definitely was not funny at the moment. So my first week in Kenya, you know, I was a special operations guy. I had gone to Stanford. I thought I was all that, you know, the cat's meow. And I'm going into these places, going to solve everybody's problems. And I remember the very first week that I got there, I got attacked by thieves. I got attacked by black widow spiders and safari ants. We had an earthquake. I got malaria. And then on the last day of the week, on my birthday, I got struck by lightning. So yeah, you laugh now. I mean,
that's a bad week.
It's a bad week, you know? And I thought to myself, man, somebody is telling me something here. I am not supposed to be here. You know, I had never quit anything in my life, but for the first time, I wanted to quit. And I think that was an important lesson for me. I needed to be humbled. I was coming into this situation very arrogant. And if I had continued with that route, I would have not had any impact. You know, the impact that we've had, honestly, in the last 8 years has been in spite of all my weaknesses and mistakes and failures, really attributed to my team and the lessons that I learned through humility. And that was the first major lesson. I went to my partner there, Philip Mahochi, who was helping me build this project, a strong Kenyan man who'd gone back to his community to help them come out of extreme poverty. And I told Philip, I know we've agreed to do this project together, but I mean, I've had a bad week. And
I got struck by lightning. I mean, come on, malaria.
I think it's actually better to go to combat than to be here. And he said, look, I know you've had a really bad week, but before you go, I want you to remember what you saw in those villages this week when we were out there doing our needs assessment. You know, you had a bad week, you got malaria, but you also had medication, you got better. Some of those kids we saw this week got malaria too, and many of them died because they didn't have medication. Those mothers had a bad week the week before too, when they couldn't feed those kids, and they had a bad week the week before that. They have a bad week every single week. You had one bad week. But if you stay here, we can partner together and we can transform this region so these people never have a bad week ever again. And so that was the motivation that I needed to stay. And we stayed and we started building together, and some really special things happened as we grew it.
Where are you today? Number of employees, which has grown tremendously, budget, and then let's talk about programs.
So since we started with a handful of farmers in September of 2008, we've actually empowered over 100,000 people now permanently out of extreme poverty in Kenya and Ethiopia. We exited the Kenya project, leaving behind a strong, resilient organization that's continuing to be led by Kenyans and scaled by Kenyans, freeing people from extreme poverty. Opened up a project in Ethiopia that's growing much more quickly than the one in Kenya because we're learning from our mistakes we made in Kenya. We have a global staff of over 300 now, so Americans, Kenyans, Ethiopians, and also now Nigerians. We're running about a $7 million annual budget, and we've raised about $40 million to get us where we are today.
And so you have farming, agriculture, entrepreneurship empowerment is a piece of this, health, education. Describe some of the programmatic elements.
So our model really is fundamentally based on leadership. You know, it's the philosophy that a strong Kenyan woman with the same skills and knowledge that I have is far more capable of solving her own problems than I will ever be. The key is unlocking that potential. So we've developed a philosophy, process, and a curriculum to identify the right local leaders to work with and equip them with the skills they need to design highly effective, sustainable programming in agriculture, financial inclusion, health, and education. Programs that can lift these communities out of poverty, not for a day or week or month or even a year, but permanently. And so then once the organization is built, and we're increasing crop yields, and we're decreasing malaria rates, and we're forming savings clubs so they can bring in additional streams of income. We're increasing literacy rates in the local school system. Once we have the organization set that can do that, and it's run by Kenyans, and it can be grown by Kenyans, then we, the expats, we exit. We're all about exit because we know that when we leave, they can do even better than we were when we were there.
It's kind of in the same vein, but you have a lot of success stories, personal success stories, and you yourself, I mean, you're over there, you're embedded, you're living there, so you get to see this impact firsthand. Share maybe one or two, you don't have to name names, but share one or two success stories.
Well, there's one woman that comes to mind every time. She's actually one of the first women that I met in Kenya when I was out there. And I'd come in there that first week I met her out in the field, and she was explaining to me her story. She was in a really desperate situation. She had 6 kids. She had lost 3 to malaria. She was producing about 3 bags of corn on her 1 little acre. She needed about 6 to survive and feed her family. They were in a really chronically hungry situation. The kids were getting maybe 1 meal a day. So a very desperate situation. As she was telling me her story, I, in my arrogance, was telling her all the great programs I was going to bring there. And here's how I'm going to solve your problems. And as I was talking, she interrupted me and she said, "Stop." And I was like, "Excuse me?" She said, "Stop. I don't need you to tell us what we need here. Me and the other 10 women who have lived in this village, we know what we need. And actually, we have some great ideas on how to solve these problems. What we need you to do is listen to us and get us up off the ground with these programs. Help us get started, and then we'll take care of the rest." And that was one of the best lessons that I ever learned, understanding that those trapped in extreme poverty are the key to the solution. Not bringing in prefabricated solutions and force-fitting those into a community because you think you know what's best. The people who live in these conditions know what's best. They just need a little catalyst to get things started. And so it's a great success story with her. She helped us build out the initial agriculture program, increased her crop yields from 3 bags of corn per acre to 18 that first season. She was able to feed her family. She sold the surplus for additional income, bought a plow cow, started a business to plow the other farmers' fields, got additional income from that. She became a field officer first for Nuru in charge of 50 families. And now if you go back there to Kenya, you'll see her as a field manager in charge of over 500 farm families. And I'll tell you what, that woman is a tough lady, and I steer clear of her when I'm on the project. She really cracks the whip.
What's interesting though is you have kind of this laser focus, and I say that, and I want you to share, but you definitely encourage them to keep business, and then the nonprofit and the giving side to keep them separate so that you can really be effective. So in other words, don't try to be everything to everyone. Really manage your business, let it thrive, and then use that to be the fruits of the labor to help others. Share kind of that philosophy on the for-profit side, the nonprofit, because you have a little bit of both sides with Nuru International and overall a lot of the things that you do.
Yes, one of the components of the model I did not share about is our financial sustainability component. So in Kenya, we started a for-profit company that's totally separate from our poverty eradication model, the nonprofit side. That for-profit company is based in a place called Kisumu. It's a poultry and dairy business. So it's a 30,000 chicken poultry farm. We sell eggs, we sell meat, And on the dairy side, we actually package and sell yogurt into the marketplace. That company is just a for-profit company. It's legally structured so that as it becomes profitable, the majority of those profits have to flow in to pay for the ongoing costs of the nonprofit programs, the agriculture, the financial inclusion, the education, healthcare programs, so that eventually it can be totally self-sustaining. It becomes independent of donations, independent of philanthropy, and it can stand up on its own based on markets, not altruism and philanthropy.
See, I just love that when you talk about how do you do this in a sustainable way. Corporate philanthropy, driving success, but using those revenues to then fund the giving side. What are some of the lessons? Because obviously, I mean, you've shared tons of them just within this interview alone, but when you look at what you're doing to eradicate poverty internationally, obviously we have poverty here in the U.S., even here, right here in Memphis, Tennessee. What are maybe one or two bits of advice that you'd say, based on what I've learned? And I think one of them is to listen, because those in poverty know versus us bringing in a cookie cutter idea. But what are some other lessons that you say, hey, based on my experience, here are some things that we can do here in the States to help lift our citizens?
I would say, in my humble experience, I would say, first of all, donors, well-meaning individuals who want to help, we have to get out of this mentality that we want to create something that we can feel, we can touch, we can put a name on. A building, a project that you can physically see and point to, a sexy gadget, technology gadget. Those are all components that are necessary to help out with the problem, but they're not the golden ticket. If you think about how to solve poverty, how to solve disenfranchisement, you have to focus on people. And the challenge is, it's difficult. What we do for that is we have a leadership program. We work very hard to restore the agency to local leaders that we're working with, so they feel like they have a real seat at the table in discussing solutions. I think in solving poverty here in our country, we've got to go to those trapped in poverty, give them a seat at the table, and have them a critical part of, not a token part, a critical part of the discussion in solving these problems. Because by doing so, the solutions that are created can be owned by them. They can be owned by the community. Instead of an outsider coming in and having to continue to pour in money and leadership to be able to run these projects indefinitely, government or private or whatever. The community has to own these solutions. And the only way that can happen is if they're part of the initial design, if they have a real seat at the table and they're considered critical to solution design. I think restoration of agency and taking a young man or woman in North Philadelphia or in South Central LA and put them at the seat at the table and say, look, you're the solution here. We can't do this without you. Just like any of us, we want to be acknowledged. We want to have the value that we have be seen by others,
right, and
not be seen as a beneficiary or some helpless person that needs to be helped, but actually a critical part of the solution.
You're working as another chapter or next chapter pretty heavily in some areas that, when you look at our national security on an international level, these are very dangerous places, right? So these are the next ISIS breeding grounds. Share a little bit about what you're doing there, tied back to, I think, this idea of what's America's role in international policy, international security. If we're not leading, who is? I mean, talk about kind of your philosophy and what you're doing on that level.
Sure. I got into this because of what I saw on Highway 7 in 2003. I began to see, and my guys began to see, this gap in our national security strategy. And what you will see now is most senior leadership, including Secretary Mattis, know that we cannot continue just to kill our way out of this problem. Violent extremism is one of the greatest crises that we face, not just as a nation, but as a global community today. And the only way we will defeat it is if we create a more holistic strategy in addressing the problem. Yes, we need military action, we need the kinetic side, but we also need proactive development that can remove the desperation that allows these movements to thrive and grow. And so when I think about that, when I think about who's going to step forward and do that, it's got to be us. America must lead in this. We have to lead in proactive development, as we have led in military. We have the finest military in the world, and we've been great at leading militarily, but we also need to lead in proactive development. When America doesn't lead, the Rwandan genocide happens. Aleppo happens. The rise of ISIS happens. If we won't lead, others will step in to fill that leadership gap, and I can assure you, we will not like who steps in to fill that gap.
So how do we help? how does America help what you're doing with Nuru International? How do we help make a difference?
Well, if you think about the question in terms of what you just said in those words, it can be really overwhelming. You know, as a community leader here in Memphis, to be able to think about these international problems and how you might plug yourself into that, I think that's maybe the wrong question to ask. I think the right question to ask is, how can we as leaders in the community help this country lead again? And I think it starts here in Memphis. It starts in your own community. I think if the solutions to these problems are not going to be made in Washington, D.C., frankly. They're not going to be made in London or Paris or in Geneva. The solutions to these problems are going to be in small towns around this country and around the world. We have to come together as citizens. We have to engage in discourse to be able to solve first the problems in these communities, our own communities. And honestly, one of the reasons our nation is weaker right now is because we are so divided. We have lost sight of what makes us Americans. We've lost sight of what unites us. And we've got to come together to be able to discuss again what the common core values of this nation are, what the common core values around freedom, and lasting, meaningful choices for everyone, everywhere. Let's remind one another, not just about our differences. Yes, we need to discuss those, but we also need to discuss our common core values again. And by doing that, we can begin a discourse where we can solve problems first locally, then nationally, then globally. Last question is the easy one. Where do we go to learn more? So what's the website for Nuru International? How can we learn more? So www.nuruinternational.org, N-U-R-U, international.org. Well, Jake, thank you very much for your service to our country, for all you're doing to change the lives of people all around the world. Thank you for joining us for A Conversation with Jake Harriman.